minute. Who are you? I'll tell you a secret.
It is I, King Gray, Master Duelist reincarnated. Hello, my name is Sean, and welcome back to another episode of I Got Distracted While Trying to Read Malazan and Read Something Else in Its Place. Today we're going to be talking about Jobless Reincarnation. We're going to be talking about something that is very much based off of Jobless Reincarnation. The Beginning After the End, the Publisher Pack number 1. So, before we get into the review, I wanted to talk about a couple different things first. If you clicked on this, there are a couple different versions of this story. So, the novel came out first in 2017, but a year later, they started a webcomic adaptation of it. And I've only read the first couple chapters of the webcomic, but I'm instead focusing on the light novel series. The publisher pack covering, books 1 and 2 of the series, but this is a light novel that you can find online. I will link it down below, so if you don't actually buy the compiled version of it, then you can still check it out, or check out the webcomic. The first 2 chapters I saw of it were actually pretty good, so it seems like a pretty enjoyable format. Before we really dive into this novel itself, I want to talk about the genre that it's actually in, which I would consider progression fantasy. Progression fantasy is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, where I will happily take, a worse plot, worse character development, worse, writing in general, but in return I get see those sick fantasy power-ups, like back in the days of like Dragon Ball Z, and just these really ridiculous epic proportion scenarios where you have a main character that just gets stronger and stronger, or it's just so overpowered that the problems that arise in the novel are actually to do with him trying to overcome the obstacles in his way. But them obliterating those obstacles, creating weird sub-obstacles, and the issue isn't do they have enough power, but all their problems are caused from the overwhelming source of power. Classical examples of this that I really enjoy would be like One Punch Man, Mob Psycho 100, Kelcade's King's Dark Tidings, and there's a score of other ones. If you get more into the progression fantasy itself, some ones I actually really do enjoy would be, Mother of Learning, or the quality of writing with those, while not necessarily always worse, generally it is a bit worse than when you compare that to traditional epic fantasy, just because the stakes and characterization generally is a bit lower, and instead I focus more on that progression series. Generally in this genre, there are a couple of different arcs that you'll see, but reincarnation is definitely a staple of it. You get to watch the main character grow faster, or exponentially faster than everyone else around him. And generally, you're going to see he always has the upper hand. Sometimes you start out with an abnormally weak person that just grows incredibly strong, so part of the enjoyableness of watching it is you're watching this person skyrocket in strength and competency, but the gap is so huge that you're just left waiting for that moment of actual triumph. So you could spend 3/4 of a book where the character's just getting his ass kicked over and over again, but you have watched the abnormal speed of which he rose from just a complete bottom to the top, or the zero to hero. So the enjoyability comes when he finally breaks through that ceiling, and then just no one else can really touch him. But it takes a turn once you actually break through. You start to see that the character's problems are coming actually from the overpoweredness, or the scope just gets absurdly long, and this creates some problems within that genre, because you have a couple limitations. You can't have the characters get too powerful and the scope creep get too much, because that becomes the Dragon Ball Z issue or the Superman issue, where the enemies you have to bring in get more and more absurdly powerful, where you just lose all sort of suspension of disbelief. Cradle series, I think, fell victim to this later on, as you have characters start out, with fairly normal martial arts stuff, basic key powers, everything makes sense. The levels of power in there are pretty well tracking, but as you get to books 8 or 9, they're throwing actual mountains at each other, and you see the pinnacle of the powers where, a person uses a sword to slice down, the person dodges, and then a solar system explodes behind them because of the level of power, and you get this crazy scope that there's no actual way that you can relate to that level of power. So the trick to this is a progression fantasy novel has to be either engaging on something that's not actually related to the power that's being gained, or the process of gaining power has to be so enjoyable for you to read and enjoy that as you're watching the absurd amount of power that's given, it's not the actual power being used that is what's entertaining, but instead the power that's being acquired. And watching these really cool training sequences and seeing a character develop from zero to hero is generally just what I think attracts a lot of people to this genre. What the problem that the character has to grow in isn't necessarily power. Yes, for progression fantasy, that has to be a big portion of it. But for a character to grow in other ways or have struggles, you have to make that either a moral dilemma or character arcs or some other character flaw that's not directly related to strength. You already know in progression fantasy that they're going to skyrocket in there and you'll enjoy going there, but to make it truly special and you to fully enjoy the story itself, you have to then have something else to draw you in. Maybe it's, you had an emotionally stunted character or a weak character with no friends, and despite all the power, he has to learn how to fully embrace the other sides of life. Going back to One Punch Man, you have a character who wanted to be a superhero for the enjoyment and the adventure, to have everything explode onto him to one punch. So for him, even though it's more based on the comedy aspect of it, he still has to learn how to enjoy life despite all that, because he's so overpowered that it's just boring for him to do anything else. And for you get to enjoy the humor of what happens when he's that overpowered and to him trying to grow and become a better person as he went on, or bringing people around and watching people react to just that absurd level of strength. And you're watching people way up here, or they think they're up here, just absolutely get humbled. So we got to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the start of the beginning after the end and its resemblances to Jobless Reincarnation. Now, in progression fantasy, there is a lot of overlap. I've seen the reincarnation thing happen a lot, but the influences of Jobless Reincarnation on the beginning after the end are absurdly similar to the beginning, where you have a lot of the start or the re-characters basically going through the same exact sort of setup, being born to adventurer parents, having an elf friend almost immediately, being able to learn magic at a really young age. It felt almost like it was a fan fiction at first, but they took that fan fiction and ran with it, and it became something original at the end. What is interesting, though, and where I think Jobless Reincarnation shines, is you have a character who doesn't have a lot of redeemable qualities. He was an absolute loser in his life, just did absolutely nothing to do with his life, and just really wasted his one chance on Earth. And then when he died, he was able to get reborn, and with his perspective, learn and grow. So part of his character development was he was a lot more sympathetic, because you're watching him grow from just an absolute loser of a person to learning how to connect with people, overcoming the trauma that he suffered in his life that caused him to have all these issues. And, he's treating it more like a video game where he's progressing, but the beginning after the end starts with that premise and says, hey, let's take all the things that, sucked about the Jobless Reincarnation character and get rid of all of that. So you're watching, someone who was a king in his former life, a king based on combat competency, and then putting him into a new fresh start. So going through the first few chapters of it was kind of jarring. I was having to go back to see, did other people notice this really level of similarity? Is the rest of it going to be just a play-by-play version of Jobless Reincarnation? Is it going to be a more boring version of it? Because, part of the appeal of that was I was watching a character grow from, an absolute zero with no skills to becoming someone who was likable and personable. Taking someone who is already competent in all these things and just throwing them in a fresh start, is that still something that I would enjoy? The answer is yes. So I thought for the comparisons here that the progression system that was present in the beginning after the end was a much better progression system than in Jobless Reincarnation, and because of that I was able to latch in a bit more and wanting to see the growth a bit more than Jobless Reincarnation. Yeah, there's less stakes in it, and the character is by far way more powerful than what it would be that way, but there's something inherently hilarious about having a 2-3-year-old with a sword going around beating up adults. And what I would say is, if you start reading it and you put it down because you saw those same similarities and you thought it was kind of a ripoff, still pick it back up and finish it, because I'd say if you liked Jobless Reincarnation, you would like this one. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the series and give you kind of an overview. Warning, there will be light spoilers ahead. I'm going to at least give you the context and setup of the series. If you don't want to have anything spoiled, stop, check it out now, and then come back later. I don't know. We get to follow Arthur Lewin. He's a former king of a dystopian Earth that had a key-based mana system. It was set in the future, and basically he was a character where the monarchs were chosen by how competent they were as duelists. The war system in that previous Earth was, rather than having countries battle it out and ruin each other that way, you would have a kings square off against the other rulers. Maybe they had a small squad versus squad combat, but really, if you get to that position of being in charge of stuff, you know how to fight. The idea of, rulers battling it out to determine conflicts seems somewhat appealing and yet somewhat familiar. But basically, we have this epitome duelist master who also has his own form of key magic going on that he is also a master at, start out reincarnated in a baby in a world that not only still has magic, but is set back in a much more archaic time, and the magic that's there is much more prevalent and powerful than it was in his previous life. Having had to reach the pinnacle of that previous life, he was able to analyze, what it was like up there. What were the things that he regretted? What did he want to change about this life? And in his previous life, he was an orphan that watched his headmaster get murdered and decided to get up to charge so he would have the power to revenge them, but he came from a very lonely background. With this new life, having been born to parents and actually knowing it and developing close bonds, his main motivation is that he doesn't want to lose his loved ones, which is what makes him sympathetic. So rather than trying to race to the very top just for power's sake, he wants to get enough power where he can keep this newfound love and companionship that he's found, around and going. And as the series progresses, they definitely set up some things where it's not just, I have to protect my parents, or I have to protect these things. He makes enemies. He decides, he gets put in situations where he needs to have extra power to protect it and gets put these different obligations. So even though this character is super powerful and will just progress to an absurd amount of power and be at the top eventually, the matter then becomes like, how fast can he do it, and will he be able to do it in the time? Because there are actually enough threats in here that give it a plausible amount of tension and conflict. So you get to watch this basically king inside of a baby learn how to read, learn how to do magic very early, and still have the reflexes of the sword master in this previous combat experience. There's some very humorous conflicts that happen in there, where his father, a former adventurer and sword master, wants to go duel with him and teach him how to fight, only to find that his 3-year-old, 4-year-old son has gravitas and sword skill of someone who's been a veteran battle and an expert duelist for years. And that's a recurring kind of theme and joke in here, is because he was a master and key in his former life and sword combat and stuff, you're watching him more adapt that to a new world rather than starting out from scratch. Not to mention this world that he's now in is more of a medieval type of thing, so you're having someone who is in a futuristic dystopian Earth with that type of technology and insight and education going around in what's essentially a medieval place and using that knowledge to its best advantage. And you're seeing the journey of him newly developing friends and bonds and trying to get the strength to protect them, and it builds with enough enjoyment in the progression itself, and wanting to see where it's actually going to go, what new abilities it's going to develop, and what new friends and compatriots and enemies he's going to make, where it's a fun read. I picked it up as something that I could do while I was working and not have to pay too much attention. Definitely didn't need a break from Malazan or anything. And I wound up getting super into it, where I stopped reading Malazan just so I could finish this book and see what happened. So for a pure enjoyability standpoint, I thought it was pretty well done and worth checking out. It's hard for me to review progression fantasy books and books of these type as the same as I would a epic fantasy or the more critically acclaimed novels I would, because what subjectively attracts me to these books are completely different. The writing on this, the prose, it's nothing special. The plot, somewhat predictable. It's not like I would say this is a critically well-written book, but it is extremely enjoyable to read. And for me, that rates it highly. Within the genre itself, I think there are better examples or things that I would recommend as first-time progression fantasy readers. Some of the books I mentioned earlier. For within the genre, it stands pretty solid. If you have read those books and enjoyed it, or you were a fan of some of those animes I mentioned earlier, I would say it's definitely worth checking out. But what I can really say, or the only rating I can give it, is that I find it subjectively good. Not great, but highly enjoyable. Don't get me wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, and I will continue reading the series until it probably gets bad, just because I have a feeling that the scope creep's not going to be managed properly. But I enjoyed it. You just have to accept it for what it is. So if you're more interested in these type of books or progression fantasy in general, there are some good examples of it. Some are pulling it off better than others. There's only a few books I would say that are loosely attached to this genre that I've started strong and finished strong, with some overlap with the lit RPG genre. If you are looking for books of this vein that I think are done like completely well, Awaken Online series is pretty good. They're one of the few to have started a story, finish a story, and just have it be strong throughout with stakes. And while that one's more of a lit RPG, it does have a lot of overlap with it. The Cradle series is pretty good and fun, but as it gets into books 9 and 10 and 11, it has those issues of scope creep where it gets so big that they then start trying to focus on other characters because they realize just the sheer level of conflict that's happening is almost too unrealistic and too unrelatable. But in my mind, it's a little too late for that, so it's fun for 8-9 books, and then it starts to become a drag. Mother of Learning, it's a really good book series. I just finished book 3 not too long ago. It has some issues with characterization, but just for sheer enjoyability, it is a blast. And at least books 1 and 2 are amazingly done, book 3 just being okay. All that being said, I appreciate you guys watching and checking out this video. I will eventually release Malazan one of these days. Hope you liked it. If you want more of this type of content or more light novels, let me know. I am going to continue to try to slog through the rest of Malazan just to see what's up with it. We shall see. Anyway, thanks for stopping by.